Our history is full of grand moments. We hear about big wars, famous inventions, and powerful rulers. But that's not the whole story. The past is also a very strange place. It's filled with events that make no sense, and events that sound like they were made up for a movie. Did a whole town really dance itself to death? Did the United States military once fight a fake battle in the middle of Los Angeles against an enemy that wasn't there? And what about the time a pope dug up his dead predecessor and put the corpse on trial? These things sound impossible, but they happened. The official records are there. The stories have been passed down. Sometimes the weirdest parts of history tell us more about people than the famous battles do. They show us how fear can spread, how strange beliefs can take hold. Or sometimes, they just show us that life can be completely, utterly absurd. These are the stories that get left out of the big textbooks. They're too messy, too confusing, or just too strange to fit into a neat timeline. But they are real. And they raise a lot of questions about what we think we know about the past and about ourselves. Number 21, did a nation really declare war on birds and loons? Yes, it happened in Australia in 1932. The enemy wasn't another country. It was the emu. And this wasn't a joke. It was a real military operation. It's officially known as the Emu War. Here's the background. After World War I, the Australian government gave land to thousands of veterans to become farmers. Many settled in Western Australia, but life was hard. The Great Depression had just hit. Wheat prices were falling, and then came the emus. Around 20,000 of them migrated into the area after their breeding season. They found the farmers' fields. The wheat was tasty. The water was plentiful. For the emus, it was a paradise. For the farmers, it was a disaster. The birds were destroying the crops. They were tearing down fences, which also let rabbits in. The farmers, many of them ex-soldiers, went to the government for help. They asked for machine guns. The Minister of Defense, Sir George Pierce, agreed. He saw it as a good public relations move. He also thought it would be good target practice for the soldiers. The plan seemed simple. A small group of soldiers, armed with 2 Lewis machine guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition, would go and deal with the emu problem. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was put in charge. The press was even invited to watch. Everyone expected a quick victory. The first battle took place on November 2nd, 1932. The soldiers found a flock of about 50 emus. They set up their guns, but the emus were smart. They were also very far away. The first shots missed. The flock scattered. Later, they found a bigger group, maybe 1,000 emus. This time, the soldiers waited for them to get closer. But when they opened fire, one of the guns jammed after just a dozen shots. The emus ran. The soldiers had killed maybe a handful of birds. It was a complete failure. Major Meredith was shocked. He noted in his report that the emus seemed to have leaders. One large emu would stand watch while the others ate. At the first sign of danger, it would give a signal, and the flock would scatter. He wrote, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." He said they were like Zulu warriors. They were almost impossible to hit. The military tried again a few days later. They ambushed a group of emus near a dam. This time they killed a few more. But the numbers were still tiny. After about a week of this, Major Meredith's unit had used over 2,500 rounds of ammunition to kill, at best, a few hundred emus. The media started to make fun of the whole thing. One politician in the Australian Parliament asked if they would be giving medals to the emus. The whole operation was called off. The military went home. The emus had won. The farmers were still desperate. The emu problem didn't go away. A few weeks later, the military was sent back out for a second try. They had a little more success this time. The official report claimed nearly 1,000 emus were killed. But the overall kill-to-bullet ratio was still terrible. It took about 10 bullets to kill one emu. The whole thing was just too expensive and ineffective. The military pulled out for good in December. In the end, the government found a better solution. They put a bounty on the emus. They paid farmers and hunters for every emu they killed. This was far more successful than the military operation had been. Over the next few years, tens of thousands of emus were killed through the bounty system. But the story of the official war remains. It's a classic example of a government trying a complicated military solution for a problem that needed a simpler one. It's a story of humans underestimating nature in a spectacular way. The ornithologist Dominic Cervantes summed it up perfectly when he commented on the emus's clever guerrilla tactics. So, Australia did lose a war to birds. The military was deployed and they failed to achieve their objective. They retreated. That's a defeat. It sounds like a comedy sketch, but it was a real, documented, and embarrassing moment in history. But a few things about it are still strange. Were the emus really as organized as Major Meredith claimed, with leaders and coordinated tactics? Or was he just trying to save face after being outsmarted by a flock of birds? How much of the story was exaggerated by the media at the time to make the government look foolish? And what does it say about us that our first instinct when faced with a problem in nature is so often to declare war on it? Number 20. Did a town really dance itself to death? It sounds like a dark fairy tale. A town where people started dancing and just couldn't stop. They danced for days. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. Some even died. But this wasn't fiction. This was the Dancing Plague of 1518. It all started in Strasbourg, a city in what is now France. In July of that year, a woman named Frau Troffea walked out of her house and began to dance. She didn't have any music. She just danced. Her husband begged her to stop, but she couldn't. She danced for hours until she collapsed. After a short rest, she got up and started again. She kept this up for nearly a week. Soon, other people joined her. Within a week, there were more than 30 people dancing in the streets. They weren't celebrating, their faces were filled with fear and pain, but they couldn't stop moving. The city authorities were baffled. The doctors of the time had no idea what was happening. They consulted their books and came to a strange conclusion. They decided the dancing was caused by hot blood. Their recommended cure was even stranger. They thought the people just needed to dance the fever out of their systems. So, the city council did something that made the problem much worse. They set aside a public space for the dancers. They cleared out one of the city's guild halls. They even built a wooden stage. To encourage the healing, they hired musicians to play pipes and drums. They thought if they helped the people dance continuously, the sickness would pass. Instead, it encouraged more people to join in. The sight of the stage and the sound of the music seemed to make the epidemic spread. By August, the number of dancers had grown to around 400. The situation was out of control. People were dancing day and night. The constant movement was taking its toll. People's feet were bloody and torn. Many were suffering from dehydration and starvation. Dozens of people died. Historical records mention deaths from heart attacks, strokes, and pure exhaustion. The city's plan had been a disaster. Realizing their mistake, the authorities changed their strategy. They banned all public dancing and music. They took the dancers who were still alive to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. They believed the saint could cure them. The dancers were made to pray. Slowly, over the next few weeks, the dancing stopped. The plague was over. What could possibly cause something like this? For centuries, people believed it was a curse or a supernatural event. But modern historians and scientists have a few theories. The leading one is mass psychogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. This is when a group of people, usually under a lot of stress, start to show similar physical or psychological symptoms. Life in Strasbourg in 1518 was incredibly hard. The area had been hit by famine, disease, and extreme poverty. The people were desperate and deeply superstitious. The historian John Waller, who wrote a book about the plague called A Time to Dance, A Time to Die, argues that the people of Strasbourg believed that St. Vitus could curse people by making them dance uncontrollably. He suggests that when Frau Troffea started dancing, others, who were already stressed and deeply religious, saw it as a supernatural punishment. Their own minds then produced the same symptoms. It was a shared trance-like state, fueled by fear and belief. Another theory suggests the cause was physical. It points to ergot, a type of mold that can grow on damp rye, which was used to make bread. Ergot fungus can cause a condition called ergotism. One of the symptoms is muscle spasms and convulsions. Some have argued that this could explain the uncontrollable dancing. However, this theory has problems. Ergot poisoning also usually causes hallucinations and cuts off blood flow to the limbs, often leading to gangrene. The historical records of the dancing plague don't mention these other symptoms. Most of the dancers seem to be moving in a coordinated way, not just spasming randomly. So mass hysteria seems the most likely explanation. It was a psychological plague, not a biological one. A product of extreme stress and a culture that believed in supernatural curses. It's a terrifying reminder of how powerful the human mind can be. But some questions are hard to answer. Why did it start with that one woman, Frau Trophea? Was there a specific trigger we don't know about? And if it was purely psychological, how could it physically compel people to dance to the point of death? Could a similar phenomenon, a kind of social contagion, happen today in our age of social media and instant communication? Number 19. Did a pope really put a dead body on trial? The history of the papacy is full of politics, power, and intrigue, but nothing is quite as bizarre as the time a living pope decided to prosecute a dead one. This event is known as the Cadaver Synod. It happened in Rome in the year 897, and it is one of the strangest and most gruesome episodes in the history of the Catholic Church. The main characters in this story are two popes. The defendant was Pope Formosus. He had been dead for about 9 months. The prosecutor, judge, and jury was the current pope, Pope Stephen VI. The conflict between them was rooted in the messy politics of 9th century Italy. The region was split between different factions, all fighting for control. Formosus had been on one side of this political divide. Stephen VI was on the other. Stephen VI was under pressure from a powerful Roman family who had been enemies of Formosus. They wanted to erase Formosus's legacy completely. So Stephen VI came up with a plan. He ordered that the body of Pope Formosus be exhumed from its grave. The rotting corpse was dressed in full papal robes. Then it was propped up on a throne in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the main cathedral in Rome. The trial began. A young deacon was appointed to speak for the dead pope. He stood next to the corpse and tried to answer the charges that Stephen VI was shouting at the body. The charges were mostly political. Formosus was accused of perjury, of coveting the papacy, and of breaking church law by serving as a bishop in 2 places at once. The whole event was a horrifying spectacle. The Grand Basilica was filled with cardinals and bishops, all forced to watch as their current pope screamed at a 9-month-old corpse. Unsurprisingly, the dead pope lost the case. Formosus was found guilty. Pope Stephen VI then declared all of Formosus' acts and ordinations as pope to be null and void. This created chaos in the church, as it meant that many priests and bishops who had been appointed by Formosus were now technically not priests or bishops at all. But the verdict wasn't the end of the humiliation. The punishment for the corpse was brutal. Stephen VI walked over to the body and personally cut off the 3 fingers on the right hand. These were the fingers that Formosus had used for blessings. After that, the papal robes were torn from the body. It was dressed in rags and buried in a common grave. Even that wasn't enough. And a little while later, Stephen VI ordered the body to be dug up again. This time, it was tied with weights and thrown into the Tiber River. The people of Rome were horrified by the Cadaver Synod. It was seen as a sacrilegious and insane act. Public opinion turned sharply against Stephen VI. A few months after the trial, an earthquake damaged the basilica where the trial had been held. Many took this as a sign of God's anger. A riot broke out in Rome. Stephen VI was overthrown, put in prison, and later that year he was strangled to death in his cell. The story has one last strange twist. A monk reportedly found the body of Formosus after it washed up on the banks of the Tiber. The next pope, Pope Theodore II, officially rehabilitated Formosus. He annulled the results of the Cadaver Synod and had Formosus's body reburied with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. The church later banned the practice of putting dead people on trial. The Cadaver Synod shows just how vicious and personal politics could be in the medieval church. It wasn't just about theological debates, it was about power, family rivalries, and revenge. The event was so shocking that it damaged the reputation of the papacy for a long time. It serves as a stark reminder that even the most sacred institutions are run by flawed human beings. But what was really going on in Pope Stephen VI's mind? Was he genuinely convinced he was doing God's work, or was he just a political puppet for a powerful family? Was he suffering from some kind of madness, or was this a calculated act of political terror, designed to send a message to his enemies? And what must it have been like to be that young deacon, forced to stand next to a rotting corpse and speak on its behalf? Number 18, did an entire country shut down because of laughter? It sounds like the plot of a comedy movie. A joke so funny that people can't stop laughing. But in 1962, in the country of Tanganyika, now part of Tanzania, a laughter epidemic was no joke. It was a real and disruptive phenomenon that forced schools to close and affected thousands of people. The event began on January 30th, 1962, in a small mission-run boarding school for girls in the village of Kashasha. It started with just 3 students. They started laughing, and they couldn't stop. The laughter quickly spread to other students. It wasn't happy, joyful laughter. It was described as uncontrollable and often painful. The girls were laughing and crying at the same time. The fits of laughter could last for minutes or even hours. Some students were so incapacitated they couldn't even attend class. The teachers and staff didn't know what to do. The situation grew worse. By the middle of March, 95 of the school's 159 students were affected. The school was completely unable to function. The administration had no choice but to shut it down and send the students home. This was a huge mistake. When the girls returned to their home villages, they carried the epidemic with them. The laughter started to spread to their families and neighbors. One of the villages that was hit hard was in Shamba. Over 200 people there were affected in April and May. The epidemic continued to spread from person to person, village to village. In total, the laughter epidemic lasted for over a year, and by some estimates, it closed 14 different schools and affected well over 1,000 people. The symptoms were consistent. It started with laughter, but it was often accompanied by crying, screaming, and restlessness. Some people reported having pain, fainting, and even skin rashes. There was no clear physical cause. Doctors and researchers who investigated the event found no evidence of any toxin or disease that could explain the symptoms. The people who were affected were physically healthy. So what was going on? The most widely accepted explanation is, once again, mass psychogenic illness. It was a stress response. Let's look at the context. Tanganyika had just gained its independence from Britain in 1961. It was a time of great change, high hopes, and also immense stress and uncertainty. The students at the mission school were under a lot of pressure. They were expected to succeed and live up to the new expectations of their independent nation. The school itself had strict rules. The theory, as proposed by researchers like Christian F. Hempelman, is that this high-stress environment was the perfect breeding ground for a mass hysterical event. It likely started with one or two students who were feeling overwhelmed. Their laughter was a release of tension. But in the closed environment of the school, this behavior was seen by other students who were under the same stress. Their own brains then mimicked the symptoms. It was a social contagion spreading through sight and sound, not through a virus. The fact that it mostly affected young people also fits the pattern of mass psychogenic illness, which is more common in adolescence and in closed communities like schools or factories. The laughter was a way for a whole community to express a shared anxiety that they couldn't put into words. The epidemic eventually just faded away. There was no cure, it just stopped spreading and the fits of laughter became less frequent. It remains one of the best documented cases of mass psychogenic illness in history. It shows how physical symptoms can emerge from purely psychological stress and how quickly those symptoms can spread through a vulnerable population. But the story leaves us with unsettling questions. Why did the stress manifest as laughter and not something else, like fainting or twitching, which have been seen in other cases? What is the exact mechanism in the brain that allows one person's physical symptom to be adopted by another just by witnessing it? And in our modern world with its own unique stresses, are we immune to something like this, or is a new kind of social plague just waiting for the right trigger? Number 17, was there really a war fought over a pig? Wars have been started for many reasons: land, religion, power, revenge. But in 1859, the United States and Great Britain almost went to war over a pig. This strange standoff is known as the Pig War, and while it sounds ridiculous, it was a very tense moment that could have easily escalated into a real conflict. The source of the problem was a small piece of land called San Juan Island. It's located between the mainland United States and Vancouver Island, which is now a part of Canada. The border between the US and British territory in that area was not clearly defined. A treaty from 1846 said the border should follow the Channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver's island. The problem was there are two channels that do that. The Americans said the border was through the Haro Strait, which would give them San Juan Island. The British said it was through the Rosario Strait, which would give the island to them. For a while, this ambiguity didn't matter much, but in the 1850s, both American and British settlers started moving to the island. The British Hudson's Bay Company set up a sheep ranch there. A couple dozen American settlers also arrived and started to build farms. Both sides claimed the island belonged to their country. The situation was tense, but manageable. Until the pig. On June 15, 1859, an American farmer named Lyman Cutlar went out to his garden. He found a large black pig eating his potatoes. This wasn't the first time. He had complained to the pig's owner, a British Hudson's Bay Company employee named Charles Griffin, but Griffin didn't do anything about it. This time, Cutlar had had enough. He took his gun and shot the pig. Cutlar went to Griffin to offer to pay for the pig. He offered $10. Griffin, who was angry about his pig, demanded $100. Cutlar said he wouldn't pay that much for a pig that was trespassing and eating his crops. The argument got heated. Griffin reportedly told Cutlar, "It is up to you to keep your potatoes out of my pig." The British authorities threatened to arrest Cutlar. The American settlers got scared. They asked the U.S. military for protection. This is where things got out of hand. The local U.S. military commander was a man named General William S. Harney. He was known for being aggressive and having a strong dislike for the British. He decided to make a stand. He sent a company of 66 American soldiers led by Captain George Pickett, who would later become famous as a Confederate general at the Battle of Gettysburg, to San Juan Island. Their orders were to prevent the British from arresting any Americans. The British were not happy. The governor of British Columbia, James Douglas, ordered 3 British warships to the island. He wanted them to drive the Americans off. The British naval commander on the scene, Captain Geoffrey Hornby, was more level-headed. He could see how dangerous the situation was. He had more ships and more men than the Americans. He could have easily won a fight, but he refused to start a war over a pig. He famously said he would not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. For the next few weeks, the situation was a tense military standoff. By August, the American force on the island had grown to over 460 men with 14 cannons. The British had 5 warships in the harbor with over 2,000 men and more than 70 cannons. The 2 sides aimed their guns at each other. A single shot could have started a war. Luckily, news of the crisis eventually reached the leaders in Washington, D.C. and London, and they were both horrified that a local dispute over a pig had escalated so much. They immediately started negotiations to de-escalate. They sent high-ranking officials to the island to sort things out. They agreed that until the border dispute could be settled permanently, both the U.S. and Britain would maintain a joint military occupation of the island. Each side was allowed to keep a small force of no more than 100 men. This bizarre joint occupation lasted for the next 12 years. The American and British soldiers actually got along very well. They visited each other's camps, celebrated holidays together, and had a friendly rivalry. The tension was gone. Finally, in 1871, the 2 countries agreed to let an international commission led by Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany decide the border issue. The Kaiser and his commission sided with the Americans. In 1872, the Haro Strait was declared the official border. The British soldiers peacefully withdrew from the island. The pig war was officially over. The only casualty of the entire conflict was the pig. The story is often used as an example of how small, seemingly silly disputes can quickly escalate into major international incidents. It's also a story about how the calm judgment of a few individuals like Captain Hornby can prevent a catastrophe. But was it really just about the pig, or was the pig just the spark that lit a fuse that was already there? How much did the aggressive personality of one general, William Harney, contribute to turning a local squabble into a national crisis? And in an age of instant communication, could a small event on a disputed border somewhere in the world still spiral out of control so quickly? Number 16. Did a volcano cause a year without a summer? Imagine a year where the summer never came. A year of cold, darkness, and rain. A year where crops failed and people starved. It sounds like science fiction, but it was real. The year was 1816, and it's often called the year without a summer. The cause was on the other side of the planet, the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded history. In April 1815, a volcano named Mount Tambora on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia exploded. The eruption was colossal. It was about 100 times more powerful than the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. It ejected a massive amount of ash rock and gas into the atmosphere. The immediate effects were devastating. Tens of thousands of people were killed by the blast itself and by the tsunamis it triggered. The entire island was covered in ash, but the long-term effects were even more widespread. The eruption shot a huge cloud of sulfur dioxide and other particles high into the stratosphere. This cloud was so big that it spread around the globe. It created a kind of veil that partially blocked the sun's light from reaching the Earth's surface. The result was a dramatic worldwide drop in temperature. This phenomenon is known as a volcanic winter. The effects weren't felt immediately, but by the spring and summer of 1816, the climate was in chaos. In North America and Europe, the weather was bizarre and destructive. In the eastern United States, a strange, dry fog was observed that dimmed the sun. It was sometimes reddish or yellow in color. The sky just looked wrong. May of 1816 was cold, with heavy frost killing off the crops that had just been planted. In June, there were major snowstorms in New England and Quebec. It was reported that nearly a foot of snow fell in some places. The summer months of July and August saw more frost and freezing temperatures. Lakes and rivers had ice on them in the middle of summer. The impact on agriculture was catastrophic. The cold and the lack of sunlight meant that crops failed everywhere. In New England, it was called the Poverty Year, or 1800, and froze to death. The price of grain and corn skyrocketed. People couldn't feed their livestock, and they couldn't feed themselves. Many families in the eastern states decided to pack up and move west, hoping for a better climate. This event was a major driver of westward expansion in the United States. Europe was hit just as hard, if not harder. The continent was already struggling to recover from the Napoleonic Wars. The bad weather destroyed the harvest. It led to widespread food shortages and famine. In Ireland, the famine triggered a major typhus epidemic that killed tens of thousands. In Switzerland, the desperation was so bad that people were reportedly eating cats, dogs, and even moss. In food, riots broke out in many cities across Britain, France, and Germany. The year without a summer also had a strange cultural impact. The gloomy, dark weather is thought to have influenced the art and literature of the time. The famous landscape painter J.M.W. Turner is known for his dramatic, colorful sunsets. Some art historians believe that the spectacular red and yellow sunsets he painted were actually caused by the volcanic particles in the atmosphere. The most famous cultural product of that strange summer came from a group of writers staying near Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The weather was too cold and rainy to go outside, so to pass the time, the group, which included Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Mary Shelley, decided to have a competition to see who could write the best ghost story. Lord Byron wrote a poem that would inspire the vampire genre, but it was 18-year-old Mary Shelley who came up with the most enduring story of that gloomy summer. She wrote Frankenstein. The dark, unnatural atmosphere of 1816 seems to be woven into the fabric of her famous Gothic novel. For a long time, people didn't know what had caused the strange weather of 1816. They blamed it on sunspots or other strange phenomena. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists were able to connect the year without a summer to the eruption of Mount Tambora a year earlier. The evidence was found in ice cores from Greenland, which showed a massive spike in sulfate deposits corresponding to that time period. The story of 1816 is a powerful reminder of how interconnected our planet is. An event on one side of the world can have devastating consequences for people thousands of miles away. It shows how fragile our food supply is and how dependent we are on a stable climate. And it raises some chilling questions. We know that massive volcanic eruptions have happened in the past and will happen again. Are we prepared for another year without a summer? With our global population now many times larger than it was in 1816, how would our tightly connected global food system handle such a shock? Could a similar event today trigger not just riots, but global conflicts? Number 15, did the U.S. military fight a battle against nothing? In the early months of 1942, America was on edge. The attack on Pearl Harbor was just a few months earlier. Fear of a Japanese invasion of the West Coast was very real. People were seeing spies and saboteurs everywhere. Blackouts were enforced in coastal cities. It was in this atmosphere of high tension and paranoia that one of the strangest incidents of World War II took place, the Battle of Los Angeles. The night of February 24 to 25, 1942, began with a warning. U.S. naval intelligence issued an alert that a Japanese attack could be expected within the next 10 hours. Then, in the early hours of the morning, something was spotted on the radar. It looked like an aircraft about 120 miles west of Los Angeles. Air raid sirens blared across the city. A total blackout was ordered. Around 3 a.m., the shooting started. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade began firing their massive anti-aircraft guns into the night sky. They were shooting at something, or at least they thought they were. Over the next hour, the sky over Los Angeles was filled with the sound of explosions and the sight of searchlights sweeping back and forth. The soldiers fired over 1,400 rounds of 12.7-pound anti-aircraft shells into the air. People all over the city woke up to what sounded like a full-scale battle. Many ran out into the streets to see what was happening. They saw the searchlights and the exploding shells. Some people swore they saw enemy planes. Others described seeing a large, slow-moving object, like a blimp or a balloon. The shooting finally stopped around 4 a.m. The all-clear was sounded a few hours later. The city waited for the news. How many enemy planes had been shot down? What was the damage? The answer was bizarre. There were no downed planes. There was no evidence of any bombs being dropped. The only damage was from their own anti-aircraft shells. Several buildings and cars were hit by falling shrapnel. 3 people were killed in car accidents during the blackout. 2 others died of heart attacks, likely caused by the stress of the battle. So what had they been shooting at? The military and the government had to explain what happened. Their explanations were confusing and contradictory. The day after the event, the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, held a press conference and called the whole thing a false alarm. He blamed it on war nerves. He said there were no planes, but the very next day, the War Department, which was in charge of the Army, said the opposite. They claimed that at least 1 and maybe as many as 5 unidentified aircraft had been flying over Los Angeles. They just couldn't explain what they were or where they came from. This disagreement between the Navy and the Army only fueled more speculation. The public was confused. Had there been an attack or not? The Los Angeles Times ran a front-page photo showing, searchlight beams converging on what looked like a flying object. This image has become famous and is often used by UFO researchers as evidence of an extraterrestrial encounter. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain the Battle of Los Angeles. The most likely explanation is a combination of jitters and a simple mistake. The initial radar contact that started the whole thing was probably a weather balloon. Meteorological balloons were regularly launched from near Los Angeles. When a few nervous soldiers started firing at what they thought was an enemy plane, others saw the exploding shells in the sky. They mistook the shell bursts for enemy aircraft. In the darkness and confusion, one person's fear fed another's. It was a classic case of trigger-happy soldiers and mass panic. The idea of a secret Japanese reconnaissance flight is another theory, but it's unlikely. So Japan did have submarines that could launch small planes, and one did shell an oil field near Santa Barbara the day before. But there's no evidence that any Japanese planes were over Los Angeles that night. And it's hard to believe that a slow-moving reconnaissance plane could have survived being shot at by 1,400 anti-aircraft shells. The UFO theory persists, but there's no real evidence to support it. The famous photo is most likely just showing smoke and shell bursts illuminated by the searchlights. The Battle of Los Angeles is a fascinating case study in how fear can affect perception. In a time of war, a simple weather balloon can look like an invasion force. It shows how quickly a situation can spiral out of control when people are expecting the worst. But the official story still feels incomplete. Why did the War Department insist there were aircraft when the Navy said there were none? Was it just an inter-service rivalry, or were they trying to cover up their own incompetence? How could so many trained soldiers for over an hour all be shooting at phantom targets? And if it was just a weather balloon, why do some eyewitness accounts from that night still describe a large, silent object that moved in ways a balloon couldn't? Number 14. Did a flood of molasses destroy a city neighborhood? A flood is a terrifying natural disaster. Water can destroy everything in its path. But what if the flood wasn't made of water? What if it was a wave of thick, sticky molasses? This sounds like something out of a cartoon. But on January 15th, 1919, the city of Boston experienced the Great Molasses Flood. The source of the disaster was a massive steel tank located in Boston's North End neighborhood. The tank was huge. It was 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter. It was owned by the Purity Distilling Company. They used the molasses to produce industrial alcohol, which was used to make munitions for World War I. The tank could hold over 2.3 million gallons of molasses, and on that day, it was nearly full. It was an unusually warm day for January in Boston. The temperature had risen to above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure inside the tank was building. Around 12:30 p.m., without any warning, the tank failed. Witnesses reported hearing a series of loud rumbles, like a machine gun. Then, the steel walls of the tank ripped apart. A massive wave of molasses, estimated to be about 25 feet high at its peak, burst out. It moved at a speed of around 35 miles per hour. The wave was incredibly destructive. It was a dense, sticky tsunami. It smashed into the buildings nearby. It knocked a firehouse off its foundation. It destroyed houses and warehouses. The force of the wave was so great that it bent the steel supports of the nearby elevated railway track. A train was nearly knocked off the tracks. The wave picked up debris, horses, wagons, and people, and carried them along. The North End was a busy area. It was lunchtime. The streets were full of workers, residents, and children playing. Many were caught completely by surprise. The molasses was thick and heavy. People who were knocked over by the wave were trapped. They were smothered by the sticky liquid. It was a horrifying scene. The official death toll was 21 people. Another 150 were injured. Many of the victims were city workers and teamsters who were having their lunch break nearby. Horses that were trapped in the molasses had to be shot by police because they couldn't be rescued. The rescue effort was immediate but incredibly difficult. The molasses was waist deep in some areas. It was hard to move through. It was also cooling down and getting thicker. Firefighters tried to wash it away with water from their hoses, but this just made it spread further. It took days for the rescue and cleanup to be completed. The area was a sticky brown mess. For weeks, the Boston Harbor was brown with molasses. The cleanup took months. And for decades after the flood, residents claimed that on hot summer days, you could still smell the sweet scent of molasses in the North End. What caused the tank to fail? The Purity Distilling Company, which was a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, tried to blame the disaster on anarchists. They claimed the tank had been blown up, but a long investigation and a class action lawsuit brought by the victims proved otherwise. The real cause was simple corporate negligence. The investigation found that the tank had been built poorly. The steel used was too thin and brittle. The company had rushed its construction to meet the demand for alcohol during the war. They had never even properly tested the tank by filling it with water first. They just started pumping molasses into it. Residents had reported for years that the tank leaked. The company's solution was to paint it brown, so the leaks wouldn't be as noticeable. There were clear warning signs that the tank was structurally unsound. The rumbling noises heard just before the collapse were likely the sound of the steel plates beginning to fail. The company had ignored all the signs. They had put profits ahead of safety. The court case lasted for years. In the end, the company was found to be responsible. Though they had to pay out a large settlement to the victims and their families, the case was a landmark in Massachusetts. It set a precedent that corporations could be held liable for their failures. The disaster also led to major changes in engineering and construction standards. From then on, all major construction projects had to be certified by a qualified engineer, and the plans had to be filed with the city. The Great Molasses Flood is a strange and tragic story. It's a reminder of the destructive power of industrial accidents, and it's a lesson in what can happen when safety is ignored for the sake of speed and money. But even with the official explanation, some questions linger. Was the warm weather on that specific day the final trigger that pushed the poorly built tank past its breaking point? How did the company manage to ignore so many clear warning signs for so long without anyone in authority stepping in? And could a similar industrial disaster caused by a bizarre substance happen in a major city today? Number 13, did two popes get elected at the same time? The Catholic Church is built on the idea of a single, unified leadership under one pope. But what happens when that unity shatters? For nearly 40 years, from 1378 to 1417, the church had two popes. Sometimes it even had three. This period of chaos and division is known as the Western Schism or the Great Schism. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the early 1300s. For about 70 years, the popes had not lived in Rome. They had moved the papal court to Avignon in France. This was a period known as the Avignon Papacy. The popes during this time were all French, and they were heavily influenced by the French king. This made the rest of Europe, especially Italy and England, very unhappy. They felt the papacy had become a puppet of France. Finally, in 1377, Pope Gregory XI decided to move the papacy back to Rome. He died shortly after arriving. This is where the trouble started. The people of Rome were determined not to have another French pope. They feared that a French pope would just move the court back to Avignon. When the cardinals met in Rome to elect a new pope, a large and angry mob gathered outside. They were chanting, "We want a Roman, or at least an Italian." The cardinals, who were mostly French, were terrified. Under this intense pressure, they elected an Italian, the Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Pope Urban VI. At first, everything seemed fine, but Urban VI turned out to be a terrible choice. He had a very difficult personality. He was arrogant, suspicious, and had a violent temper. He immediately started to criticize the cardinals, insult them publicly, and threaten to take away their wealth and power. The French cardinals quickly decided they had made a huge mistake. A few months after the election, they left Rome. They gathered in a nearby town and declared that the election of Urban VI was invalid. They claimed they had only voted for him because they were afraid of the Roman mob. Then they elected their own pope, a French cardinal who took the name Clement VII. Clement VII and his cardinals moved back to Avignon. Now there were two popes, as Urban VI stayed in Rome. Clement VII was in Avignon, and both of them claimed to be the one true successor to St. Peter. Both of them excommunicated the other one and all of his followers. This split the church in two. The countries of Europe had to choose a side. France, Spain, Scotland, and parts of Italy supported the Pope in Avignon. England, Germany, Poland, Hungary, and most of Italy supported the Pope in Rome. It was a political mess as much as a religious one. For the average person, it was deeply confusing. Who was the real Pope? Which sacraments were valid? Was their soul in danger? The situation got worse. When Urban VI and Clement VII died, their respective groups of cardinals just elected new successors. The schism became entrenched. For decades, there was a line of popes in Rome and a line of antipopes in Avignon. The prestige of the papacy was destroyed. Many people started to question the whole structure of the church. Finally, after years of failed negotiations, a group of leading churchmen decided to take matters into their own hands. And they came up with a new idea called conciliarism. This was the theory that a general church council had more authority than the pope and could therefore settle the dispute. A council was called in the city of Pisa in 1409. The council declared that both the Roman Pope and the Avignon Pope were deposed. And then they elected a new third pope, Alexander V, but the popes in Rome and Avignon refused to step down. So now, instead of solving the problem, the Council of Pisa had just made it worse. There were now three popes, all claiming to be the rightful leader of the church. The schism was at its lowest point. The final solution came with another council, the Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418. This council was much bigger and had the support of the Holy Roman Emperor. It was a massive undertaking. The council managed to convince two of the three popes to resign. The third one was formally deposed. Then, in 1417, the council elected a new single pope, Martin V. This time, the election was accepted by almost everyone. The Western Schism was finally over. The schism had a profound impact on the church. It severely weakened the authority of the pope and strengthened the idea that a council could be the ultimate authority. It also fueled a lot of the discontent that would later lead to the Protestant Reformation a century later. People had seen the leaders of their church behaving like squabbling politicians, and it damaged their faith in the institution. It's a story that shows that even the most stable-seeming institutions can be torn apart by human ambition and politics. But did the cardinals in 1378 really elect Urban VI under duress, or was that just an excuse they used later when they didn't like him? How did the church manage to function for 40 years with a divided leadership? And what does this episode say about the nature of authority and legitimacy itself? Number 12. Did the sun disappear for over a year? We take the sun for granted. It rises every day. It gives us light and warmth. But imagine if, for more than a year, the sun was dimmed. Imagine living in a world of constant twilight, a strange, dusty fog that never cleared. This is not a description of a distant planet. This is what historical records say happened on Earth in the year 536 AD. It's an event that some historians call the worst year to be alive. The descriptions from the time are eerie. A Byzantine historian named Procopius wrote, "For the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year." He said it was like the sun was in a constant eclipse. Another writer in Italy, Cassiodorus, wrote that the sun had a bluish color. He said people cast no shadows at midday. He wrote of a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, a summer without heat. The effects of this mystery cloud were devastating. Without direct sunlight, temperatures plummeted. It triggered the coldest decade in the last 2,000 years. The cold caused crops to fail, leading to widespread famine from Ireland to China. In the Irish Chronicles, it's recorded that there was a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. In China, there were reports of summer snow and a massive famine. In Peru, the Moche civilization seems to have been hit by a series of floods and droughts around this time, which may have been linked to the global climate chaos. The famine and cold also likely weakened the population, making them more vulnerable to the devastating plague that arrived just a few years later, the plague of Justinian, which killed a huge portion of the population of the Byzantine Empire. For a long time, the cause of the 536 event was a mystery. The historical accounts were there, but there was no clear explanation. Scientists and historians proposed various theories: a massive volcanic eruption, the impact of a comet or asteroid, or even a cloud of cosmic dust. In recent years, a much clearer picture has started to emerge, thanks to modern science. A team led by historian Michael McCormick and glaciologist Paul Majewski conducted a detailed analysis of an ice core from a glacier in Switzerland. And ice cores are like a timeline of the atmosphere. Each layer of ice traps particles from the air of that year. When they analyzed the ice from the spring of 536, they found something specific: 2 microscopic particles of volcanic glass. This was the smoking gun. The chemical makeup of these particles pointed to a massive volcanic eruption somewhere in the northern hemisphere. The location is believed to have been in Iceland. This eruption would have been huge, spewing a massive plume of ash and sulfur into the stratosphere. This plume then spread across the northern hemisphere, creating the dimming veil that the chroniclers described. But the story doesn't end there. The ice core analysis revealed that this was just the beginning of a period of misery. There was another massive eruption in 540 and a third one in 547. It was a triple blow. The world was plunged into a volcanic winter that lasted for years. The worst year to be alive, 536, was really the start of the worst decade to be alive. This period of cold and famine seems to have been a major turning point in history. It may have contributed to the fall of some civilizations and the migration of others. It set the stage for the Dark Ages in Europe. This new scientific evidence has transformed our understanding of this period. What was once a mysterious and almost mythical event is now a documented, datable catastrophe. It's a powerful example of how scientific analysis of natural archives like ice cores can help us solve historical puzzles. But we still don't know everything. Which specific volcano in Iceland erupted in 536? The evidence is still being debated. How exactly did the climate changes from these eruptions play out in different parts of the world? And how much did this long period of darkness and starvation directly contribute to the major social and political changes that happened in the 6th century? It's a sobering thought that a single volcano can change the course of human history. Number 11, did an entire city smell so bad it changed the country? In the summer of 1858, the city of London was the richest and most powerful city in the world. It was the heart of the British Empire, but it had a very dirty secret. The city's main river, the Thames, was an open sewer. For centuries, all of London's waste, both human and industrial, had been dumped directly into the river. By the mid-19th century, with the city's population booming, the problem had reached a crisis point. The Thames was a thick, brown, toxic soup. The invention of the flush toilet, ironically, had made the problem worse. It just moved the waste from cesspools and people's basements into the river more efficiently. The river was biologically dead. The smell was unbearable. Then came the summer of 1858. It was unusually hot and dry. The level of the river dropped and the flow of water slowed down. The raw sewage that was normally washed out to sea just sat there baking in the summer sun. The result was a smell so powerful, so disgusting, that it became a national crisis. This event is known as the Great Stink. The smell was overwhelming. It wasn't just near the river. It covered the entire city. People who could afford to left London for the countryside. Those who had to stay walked around with handkerchiefs soaked in perfume held over their noses. The newspapers were full of articles and cartoons about the terrible stench. They called the Thames a Stygian pool, reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. The smell even affected the government. The Houses of Parliament are located right on the bank of the Thames. The stench became so bad that the politicians couldn't work. They tried to soak the curtains in chloride of lime to mask the smell, but it didn't work. The smell was so powerful that there was serious talk of moving the entire government out of London. But the Great Stink was more than just a bad smell. It was a public health emergency. At the time, the leading theory of disease was the miasma theory. People believed that diseases like cholera were spread by bad smells, or miasmas, in the air. The smell coming from the Thames was seen as literally deadly, and London had suffered from several devastating cholera outbreaks in the preceding decades, which had killed tens of thousands of people. The fear was that the Great Stink would trigger another, even worse, epidemic. This combination of an unbearable smell and a very real fear of disease finally forced the politicians to act. For years, there had been proposals to build a modern sewer system for London, but they had always been put on hold because of the cost and the political arguments. The Great Stink changed everything. In just 18 days, in the middle of that smelly summer, Parliament passed a bill to fund a massive new sewer system. The man put in charge of this enormous project was a brilliant engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. His plan was revolutionary. He designed a complex network of over 1,000 miles of interconnecting sewers that would run underneath the city. These sewers would intercept the waste before it reached the Thames. The sewage would then be carried far to the east of the city, where it would be treated and then released into the sea on the outgoing tide. It was one of the greatest engineering projects of the 19th century. It took years to build and was incredibly expensive. But it worked. The new sewer system cleaned up the Thames. The Great Stink was gone. And perhaps most importantly, the cholera epidemics that had plagued London stopped. Bazalgette's sewers literally saved the city. It's interesting to note that they were right to be afraid of the river, but for the wrong reason. Cholera is a waterborne disease, not an airborne one. The sewage in the Thames was contaminating the city's drinking water. By cleaning up the river, Bazalgette unknowingly removed the real source of the disease. The Great Stink is a story about how a crisis can force change. It took a smell so bad that it made the city unlivable to finally get the government to invest in essential public infrastructure. Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system is still in use in London today, a hidden monument to the summer when a bad smell changed the course of a city's history. But what if that summer of 1858 hadn't been so hot and dry? How many more people would have died from cholera before the government was finally forced to act? How much of the decision was based on genuine public health concern, and how much was just because the politicians themselves couldn't stand the smell in their own offices? And are there modern Great Stinks, obvious, slow-moving crises that we are ignoring today simply because they haven't yet become personally unbearable to those in power? Number 10 was a Polish soldier. Really a bear? The story of Wojciech the Bear is one of the most heartwarming and unbelievable tales to come out of World War II. It's the story of a Syrian brown bear who was adopted by Polish soldiers, enlisted in their army, and served alongside them in some of the most intense fighting of the war. The story begins in 1942. A group of Polish soldiers who had been released from Soviet prison camps were making their way through Iran to join the Allied forces in the Middle East. Along the way, they came across a young Iranian boy who had found an orphaned bear cub. The soldiers took pity on the small cub. One of the soldiers, Irina Bokiewicz, was particularly taken with it. The soldiers bought the cub from the boy in exchange for a few tins of food. They named him Wojtek, which is a common Polish name that means he who enjoys war or smiling warrior. At first, Wojtek was very small. He had to be fed with condensed milk from an old vodka bottle. He was treated like a pet and a mascot. The soldiers loved him. He grew up among them, and he started to think he was one of them. He would play wrestle with the soldiers, and he learned to salute when greeted. He also picked up some of their habits. He was known to drink beer, which he would drink straight from the bottle, and he would sometimes eat lit cigarettes. As Wojtek grew, he became a very large and powerful bear, but he was always gentle with his human companions. He became the unofficial mascot of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company of the Polish, the Second Corps. He traveled with them from Iran through Iraq, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. When the Polish forces were preparing to be deployed to Italy to fight in the brutal Italian campaign, there was a problem. The British authorities in the transport ship refused to allow a wild animal on board. The Polish soldiers came up with a brilliant solution. They couldn't take him as a mascot, so they would take him as a soldier. They officially enlisted Wojtek into the Polish army. He was given the rank of private, a paybook, and a serial number. As an official soldier, he was allowed to board the ship to Italy. In Italy, the Polish, the Second Corps, was involved in one of the toughest battles of the war, the Battle of Monte Cassino. This was a long and bloody fight to break through the German defensive lines. The 22nd Company's job was to transport heavy crates of artillery shells to the front lines. The work was difficult and dangerous. The terrain was mountainous, and they were under constant enemy fire. This is where Private Wojtek made his most famous contribution. He saw his fellow soldiers struggling to carry the heavy crates. Being a bear, Wojtek was incredibly strong. He started to copy the soldiers. He would go to the trucks, stand on his hind legs, and the soldiers would place a crate of shells into his paws. He would then carry the heavy crate, which normally took 4 men to lift, to the artillery positions. He never dropped a single one. He worked tirelessly, carrying ammunition to the guns, even while the battle was raging around him. He wasn't scared by the noise of the explosions. His presence was a huge morale booster for the soldiers. In recognition of his bravery and service, the 22nd Company adopted a new emblem, a picture of a bear carrying an artillery shell. This became their official insignia. After the war, Wojtek was promoted to the rank of corporal. When the war ended, the Polish soldiers were not able to return to their home country, which was now under Soviet control. Many of them, along with Wojtek, were relocated to Scotland. Wojtek became a local celebrity. But as the soldiers were demobilized and started their new civilian lives, they could no longer take care of him. In 1947, with a heavy heart, they made the decision to give him to the Edinburgh Zoo. Wojtek lived at the zoo for the rest of his life. He was a popular attraction. His old Polish army comrades would often visit him. They would call to him in Polish, and he would respond. Sometimes they would even jump into his enclosure to wrestle with him, much to the alarm of the zookeepers. Wojtek died in 1963 at the age of 21. There are now statues of him in Poland, Edinburgh, and London. Wojtek's story is a testament to the strange and powerful bonds that can form between humans and animals, even in the midst of the horrors of war. It's a true story that sounds more like a legend, but it does make you wonder, how did a wild animal become so completely integrated into a human military unit? Was his behavior, like carrying the shells, purely imitation, or did he have some understanding of what he was doing? And what must it have been like for the enemy German soldiers to look across the battlefield and see a massive brown bear carrying ammunition for the other side? Number 9, did the British government build fake cities in World War II? During World War II, deception was a crucial part of military strategy. Both the Allies and the Axis powers went to great lengths to fool each other. One of the most ambitious and strange deception projects was undertaken by the British. To protect their real cities and factories from German bombers, they built fake ones. These were known as decoy sites or starfish sites. The idea was the brainchild of a man named Colonel John Turner. He was an engineer and an expert in illusions. The plan was to create fake cities and industrial areas in the countryside, a few miles away from the real targets. These decoys were designed to look like a real city at night, as seen from the air by a German bomber crew. The goal was to trick the bombers into dropping their bombs on the empty decoy site instead of on the populated city. These were not simple setups. They were incredibly detailed and sophisticated. The starfish sites, the name came from the code name of the team that designed them, simulated the layout of a city or a factory complex. They had networks of lights that looked like streets, railway stations, and tramways. They even had lights that were designed to look like the faint glow from a blacked out city, with occasional flashes that would mimic a door opening or, a car's headlights being, accidentally switched on. But the real genius of the decoy sites was in how they simulated a city that was already under attack. This was the key to making the deception believable. They used a complex system of controlled fires and explosions. When a German bomber was spotted approaching a real city, the decoy site nearby would spring into action. They would ignite fires in special baskets filled with flammable materials. These fires were designed to look like a building that had just been hit by an incendiary bomb. They had machines that would create flashes of light to simulate exploding bombs or the arcing of a damaged electrical substation. There were even piles of scrap metal that would be heated up to glow red, looking like the embers of a burning building. The illusion was so convincing that it often fooled the German pilots. A bomber crew, flying high above in the dark, would see what looked like a city that was already being bombed. They would assume it was the correct target and drop their own bombs on the decoy fires, adding to the illusion for the next wave of bombers. The program was surprisingly successful. There were hundreds of these decoy sites built all over Britain, protecting everything from major cities like Bristol and Sheffield to important industrial sites and airfields. It's estimated that these decoys drew thousands of bombs away from their intended targets. They saved countless lives and prevented a huge amount of damage. According to official records, German bombers attacked these decoy sites over 700 times during the war. The whole operation was top secret. The people who worked at the decoy sites were often local civilians, including many women, who were sworn to secrecy. They would spend their nights in small, protected bunkers waiting for the signal to start the show. It was dangerous work. They were intentionally trying to get bombed. After the war, most of the decoy sites were dismantled. The equipment was removed and the land was returned to its original use. Today, very little evidence of them remains, just a few concrete bunkers or the faint outlines of the decoy layouts visible in aerial photographs. The story of the Starfish sites is a little known, but fascinating part of the war. It's a story of ingenuity and courage, and a powerful example of how sometimes the best weapon is a clever illusion. But how many lives were actually saved by this elaborate deception? Is it possible to ever truly know the full impact of the program? And what were the psychological effects on the German bomber crews who, after risking their lives, found out they had been tricked into bombing an empty field? Could similar large-scale physical deception tactics work in today's age of satellite imagery and precision-guided weapons? Number 8 was a man executed for being a spy because he was too good at his job. The story of Michel Hollard is a tale of incredible bravery and a tragic misunderstanding. He was a French resistance hero during World War II who created a vital intelligence network. His work saved thousands of lives by warning the Allies about the German, the fifth one, flying bombs. But his success was so great and his information so accurate that at one point, the British intelligence agency MI6 thought he was a German double agent. They believed his information was too good to be true. Hollard was a French engineer and patriot. When Germany invaded and occupied France in 1940, he was determined to fight back. He wasn't a young man, he was already in his 40s. He traveled to Switzerland and made contact with the British embassy there. He offered his services as a spy. The British were skeptical at first, but they gave him a chance. Hollard went back to occupied France and started to build his own intelligence network. He called it Réseau Aguirre, the Aguirre Network. It was made up of ordinary French citizens, railway workers, housewives, priests, and farmers. They were all volunteers, and they were all risking their lives. Hollard's method was meticulous. He would travel around northern France, often on his bicycle, gathering information about German military installations. In 1943, Hollard and his network discovered something new and alarming. They started to find strange-looking construction sites all over the countryside in Normandy. They were concrete structures with long, sloping ramps, all pointing towards London. No one knew what they were. Hollard was determined to find out. He managed to get a job at one of the construction sites. He even managed to get his hands on a blueprint for one of the strange devices being built there. He knew this information was critical. He made a dangerous journey back to the Swiss border. He, had to cross it secretly, often swimming across freezing rivers at night. He delivered the blueprint and his detailed sketches of the sites to his British contact. The British intelligence analysts were stunned. The blueprint was for the V-1 flying bomb, one of Hitler's new wonder weapons. These were essentially the world's first cruise missiles. The Germans were building hundreds of launch sites to fire these bombs at London. While Hollard's information was a bombshell, the British and Americans had no idea this program was so advanced. Based on the detailed locations provided by Hollard and his network, the Allies were able to launch a massive bombing campaign codenamed Operation Crossbow against the V-1 launch sites. They destroyed or damaged most of them before they could become operational. This action significantly delayed the V-1 attacks and saved London from a much greater level of destruction. It's estimated that Hollard's work saved tens of thousands of lives. But here's where the story takes a strange turn. As Hollard continued to deliver incredibly accurate and detailed information, some people within MI6 became suspicious. His intelligence was just too perfect. They started to wonder if he was a German plant. They thought the Germans might be feeding him this information as part of a complex deception plan. It was a classic case of counterintelligence paranoia. The idea was that no single spy network could be this good. For a time, the British cut off contact with him. They stopped trusting his information. It was a devastating blow for Hollard, who was risking his life every day to help the Allies. Luckily, some of his supporters within the British intelligence community fought for him. They argued that his information had been consistently proven to be accurate. Eventually, they won the argument, and the trust was restored. Unfortunately, Hollard's luck ran out. In February 1944, he was betrayed and arrested by the Gestapo. He was brutally tortured, but he never gave up the names of the people in his network. He was sent to a concentration camp where he was sentenced to death. In a final, incredible act of defiance, just as the ship he was on was about to be sunk by the Allies, he managed to escape. He survived the war. After the war, his heroism was fully recognized. The British government awarded him the Distinguished Service Order, one of their highest military honors. And General Eisenhower himself said that Hollard's work was one of the most important intelligence contributions of the war. His story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the truth can be so extraordinary that it's hard to believe. But what would have happened if the paranoid faction within MI6 had won the argument? How much more damage would the V1 bombs have done to London? How does an intelligence agency balance the need for skepticism with the need to trust its agents on the ground? And how did Michel Hollard find the courage to keep going, even when the very people he was trying to help began to suspect him of being the enemy? Number 7. Did a man invent a death ray and then hide it? The idea of a death ray, a weapon that can, destroy targets from a distance, using a beam of energy, has been a staple of science fiction for over a century. But in the 1920s and 30s, it was treated as a very real possibility. And the man most famously associated with this idea was the brilliant and eccentric inventor Nikola Tesla. Tesla was a genius. His work on alternating current AC electricity formed the basis of our modern power grid. He invented the radio, though. Marconi got most of the credit. He was a visionary who imagined a world of wireless communication and free energy. But in his later years, he became more reclusive and made some very grand and sometimes strange claims. One of his most famous claims was that he had designed a particle beam weapon, which he called Teleforce. The press, loving a good story, nicknamed it the Death Ray. Tesla described his weapon not as a ray, but as a beam of tiny concentrated particles that would be accelerated to a high velocity inside a vacuum chamber. This beam, he claimed, could be projected over hundreds of miles. He said it would be powerful enough to destroy 10,000 airplanes or an army of 1,000,000 soldiers from a distance of 250 miles. He saw it not as a weapon of aggression, but as a purely defensive weapon. He believed that if every country had this weapon, it would make war impossible. It would be a peace beam, creating an impenetrable wall of energy around a country's borders. Did he actually build it? There's no proof that he ever constructed a full-scale working model. He produced detailed theoretical plans, but he was always very secretive about them. He was also constantly short of money. Building such a device would have been incredibly expensive. He tried to sell the idea to various governments, including the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. He offered his plans to them, hoping they would fund his research, but most of them were skeptical. His ideas were just too far ahead of their time. The technology to create such a weapon didn't really exist yet. The FBI took his claims seriously enough to keep a file on him. After Tesla died in his hotel room in 1943, government agents from the Office of Alien Property went to his room and seized all of his papers and belongings. They were worried that his plans for the death ray might fall into the wrong hands. A scientist from MIT was brought in to examine his notes. The scientist concluded that Tesla's plans were mostly speculative and theoretical, and that there was no working model. His papers were eventually returned to his family. Tesla wasn't the only one working on this idea. Another inventor, a British man named Harry Grindell Matthews, also claimed to have invented a death ray in the 1920s. He gave a demonstration to journalists where he used his device to stop a moving motorcycle engine from a distance. The British government was interested, but Matthews was very demanding. He wanted a huge amount of money and refused to give them a full demonstration of its capabilities. The deal fell through, and Matthews's death ray was never seen again. Most people now believe it was a clever hoax. The story of the death ray is a fascinating mix of real science, wild speculation, and the larger-than-life personalities of inventors like Tesla. The idea of a directed energy weapon wasn't crazy. Modern militaries are now developing and deploying weapons that use lasers and microwaves, which are essentially a modern form of the death ray. Tesla's vision was, in a way, just a century too early, but the mystery remains. Were Tesla's plans really just theoretical speculation? as the official report claimed? Or did the government find something more significant in his notes that they decided to keep secret? Could he have built a smaller prototype version that no one ever knew about? And what would our world look like today if his vision of a defensive peace beam had become a reality? Number 6 was a war fought over a bucket. In the year 1325, two rival city-states in Italy, Bologna and Modena, went to war. The conflict that followed was one of the largest battles of the medieval period in Italy. Thousands of men were killed, and the event that is said to have triggered it all was the theft of a wooden bucket. This conflict is known as the War of the Oaken Bucket. The story sounds like a myth, but it's based on a real historical conflict. While Bologna and Modena were neighboring cities, but they were on opposite sides of a major political and religious divide that was tearing Italy apart. This was the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs supported the Pope, while the Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna was a major Guelph city. Modena was a staunchly Ghibelline city. For decades, there had been constant raiding and skirmishes between them. The two cities hated each other. The legend goes like this. A small group of soldiers from Modena snuck into the city of Bologna. They went to the main well in the city center and stole the large wooden bucket that was used to draw water. They took it back to Modena as a trophy. The people of Bologna were furious. They saw the theft as a grave insult to their honor. They demanded that Modena return the bucket. Modena refused, so Bologna declared war. This is the popular story, and it's a great one. But the reality is a bit more complicated. The theft of the bucket was probably not the cause of the war. It was more likely a symptom of the existing tensions. The real causes were a series of border disputes and political provocations. The bucket was just the final insult, the spark that lit the flame. Some historians even believe that the bucket was stolen after the main battle, not before it. Whatever the exact timing, the war was very real. Bologna raised a massive army, estimated at over 32,000 men. Modena's army was much smaller, only about 7,000 men. The two armies met at the Battle of Zappolino in November 1325. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the army of Modena won a decisive victory. They completely routed the Bolognese army. It was a humiliating defeat for Bologna. After the battle, the Modenese soldiers paraded up to the gates of Bologna, taunting their defeated enemies before returning home. And what about the bucket? The victorious Modenese soldiers did indeed have the bucket. Whether they stole it before or after the battle, they kept it as a symbol of their victory. And to this day, that very same wooden bucket is still on display in the city of Modena. It's kept in a tower in the city's main piazza, a proud reminder of a victory that happened nearly 700 years ago. The War of the Oaken Bucket is a perfect example of how a small, seemingly trivial object can become a powerful symbol in a larger conflict. It wasn't really about the bucket itself, it was about honor, pride, and the deep-seated rivalry between two cities. The bucket just gave them a physical object to focus their anger on. The story has lived on, inspiring poems and legends. It's a reminder that sometimes the official reasons for a war are not the real ones. But we're still left with questions. Was there a specific group of soldiers who planned the bucket heist? And did they have any idea what their actions would lead to? How much of the story that we know today is historical fact? And how much is legend that has been built up over the centuries? And is it possible that a modern conflict could be triggered by an equally symbolic but seemingly trivial act of theft or disrespect? Number 5, did a solar storm almost send the world back to the Dark Ages? In 1859, the world's technology was just starting to connect. The telegraph was the internet of its day. A web of wires was spreading across continents and even under oceans, allowing for near-instant communication over vast distances. But in September of that year, this new technological nervous system was hit by a massive blast from space. This event is known as the Carrington event. It began with the sun. On September 1st, 1859, an English amateur astronomer named Richard Carrington was observing the sun from his private observatory. He noticed a cluster of unusually large sunspots. Suddenly, he saw 2 brilliant flashes of white light burst forth from the sunspots. It was a massive solar flare, the most powerful one ever recorded. Carrington knew he had seen something significant, but he had no idea what was about to happen on Earth. About 18 hours later, the consequences arrived. A massive cloud of charged particles and magnetic plasma, known as a coronal mass ejection CME, that had been blasted from the sun during the flare, slammed into the Earth's magnetic field. The impact was spectacular. The northern lights, the aurora borealis, were seen all over the world. They were so bright that people in the Rocky Mountains reportedly woke up in the middle of the night thinking it was dawn. People in New England could read a newspaper by the light of the aurora. The lights were seen as far south as Cuba and Hawaii. But the Carrington event was more than just a beautiful light show. The massive influx of energy wreaked havoc on the global telegraph system. The telegraph wires acted like giant antennas, picking up the powerful electrical currents induced by the solar storm. Telegraph operators reported getting electric shocks from their equipment. Sparks flew from the telegraph machines. Some telegraph papers spontaneously caught on fire. The most bizarre effect was that the telegraph system became supercharged. The electrical currents from the solar storm were so strong that some operators were able to disconnect their batteries and continue sending and receiving messages using only the power from the aurora. They were running their telegraphs on space weather. The entire system was thrown into chaos for several days. At the time, the world was not heavily dependent on electricity. The telegraph was the only major piece of technology that was vulnerable. So, while the Carrington event was a major curiosity and a disruption, it didn't cause a global catastrophe. But now, think about what would happen if an event of that magnitude hit us today. Our modern world is completely dependent on a fragile and interconnected electrical grid. We rely on satellites for communication, navigation, GPS, and financial transactions. A Carrington-level solar storm today would be an absolute disaster. It could induce massive electrical currents in our power grids, blowing out transformers and causing widespread blackouts. These large transformers are not easy to replace. It could take months or even years to build new ones. This could lead to blackouts that last for a very long time. A modern Carrington event could also destroy a large number of our satellites. It would disrupt communications, knock out GPS systems, and cripple the internet. The economic cost would be in the trillions of dollars. It would be a catastrophe on a scale we have never experienced. In a 2008 report, the National Academy of Sciences estimated that the impact of a modern Carrington event could be 10 to 20 times greater than the damage from Hurricane Katrina. It could take a decade for the world to recover. We know that solar storms of this intensity are rare, but they do happen. Scientists estimate they occur every 150 years or so. We are now past that average. We had a near miss in 2012. A massive CME, just as powerful as the Carrington one, erupted from the sun. It just happened to be pointed in a different direction and missed the Earth. We were lucky. The Carrington event of 1859 serves as a stark warning. It was a glimpse of the immense power of the sun and our own vulnerability to it. It showed us that there are natural events that can threaten our entire technological civilization. The biggest questions are the ones about our future. Are our governments and power companies taking the threat of a major solar storm seriously enough? What steps can we take to protect our critical infrastructure, like the electrical grid and our satellite network, from such an event? And what is the plan for how society would function in the aftermath of a catastrophe that could send large parts of the world back to a pre-electric age? Number 4, did people in the Middle Ages think a part of history was fake? There is a strange and controversial theory that suggests a big chunk of the Middle Ages never happened. According to this idea, almost 300 years of history, from the year 614 to 911, were completely fabricated. This is known as the phantom time hypothesis. The theory was proposed in the 1990s by a German historian named Herbert Illig. His argument is complex, but it's based on a few key points. First, he points to a scarcity of archaeological evidence from that specific period. He argues that there are very few reliable historical documents from the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries in Europe. He claims that the documents we do have were all forged later. Second, he focuses on the switch from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar was introduced in 1582 to correct a small error in the Julian calendar. The Julian calendar had too many leap years, so it was slowly drifting out of sync with the actual solar year. By 1582, it was off by about 10 days. Pope Gregory XIII ordered that 10 days be skipped to correct this. But Illig did his own calculations. He argued that the Julian calendar should have been off by 13 days by that point, not 10. He concluded that this 3-day discrepancy means that about 300 years of history that were supposedly on the calendar never actually happened. So who would have faked 300 years of history, and why? Illig has an answer for that too. He claims it was a conspiracy orchestrated by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. He argues that Otto III wanted to be the emperor who ruled in the year 1000 AD, a very significant and symbolic year. So they just changed the calendar, adding 297 phantom years to move the date forward. In the process, they had to invent a whole cast of characters and events to fill in this fake history. One of the most famous figures who Illig claims was invented as part of this conspiracy is the great emperor Charlemagne. He argues that Charlemagne was a fictional king, a sort of King Arthur for the Holy Roman Empire, created to give the empire a glorious but fake founding story. It's a fascinating and mind-bending idea, but it's important to be very clear the Phantom Time hypothesis is rejected by virtually all mainstream historians. It's considered a classic example of pseudoscience. Historians have pointed out major flaws in all of Illig's arguments. First, there is actually a lot of archaeological and written evidence from the period he claims is fake. There are Byzantine and Islamic histories from that time that line up with the European timeline. For the Phantom Time hypothesis to be true, the conspiracy would have had to be global. Someone would have had to forge documents and plant archaeological evidence not just in Europe, but all across the Middle East and Asia. The Tang Dynasty in China, for example, has a well-documented history during this Phantom period. There are also astronomical records like observations of Halley's Comet that match the conventional timeline. Historians have also shown that Illig's calculations about the Gregorian calendar reform are wrong. He misunderstood some of the complexities of how the calendar drift was calculated. The 10-day correction in 1582 was, in fact, the correct number. And as for Charlemagne, there is a huge amount of evidence for his existence and his reign from multiple independent sources. So, the Phantom Time hypothesis is almost certainly not true. It remains a fringe theory. But it's interesting because it makes us think about how we know what we know about the past. History is not a perfect record. It's pieced together from fragmented documents, biased accounts, and archaeological finds. It's a process of interpretation. Theories like this, even when they're wrong, can be a useful exercise. They force historians to go back and re-examine their sources and strengthen their arguments. They remind us to be critical of what we read and to ask where the evidence comes from. But the theory leaves us with a kind of philosophical puzzle. How can we be absolutely 100% certain that our understanding of the distant past is accurate? If a powerful group was determined to rewrite history, how would we be able to tell? And if a historical figure as famous as Charlemagne could be questioned, are there any parts of history that we should consider completely beyond doubt? Number 3 was a nuclear device accidentally detonated in Siberia in 1908. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, a massive explosion occurred in a remote part of Siberia near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River. The blast was enormous. It was estimated to be about 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It flattened over 80 million trees across an area of more than 800 square miles. The shockwave was felt hundreds of miles away. It knocked people off their feet and shattered windows in the town of Vanovera, 40 miles from the blast site. For several nights after the event, the sky over Europe and Asia was so bright that people could read a newspaper outside at midnight. What could have caused such a powerful explosion? Because the area was so remote, it was years before the first scientific expedition was sent to investigate the site. When they finally arrived, they found a scene of utter devastation. The trees were all knocked down in a radial pattern, pointing away from a central point. But strangely, there was no impact crater. Whatever had caused the explosion seems to have detonated in the air, a few miles above the ground, rather than hitting the earth. For over a century, the Tunguska event has been one of the greatest scientific mysteries. The most widely accepted scientific explanation is that the explosion was caused by the airburst of a large meteoroid or a piece of a comet. The theory is that a space object, perhaps 100 to 200 feet in diameter, entered the Earth's atmosphere at a very high speed. The immense pressure and heat caused it to rapidly disintegrate and explode in the air before it could reach the ground. This would explain the massive blast and the lack of a crater. But this is a theory, not a proven fact. Scientists have never been able to find any definitive fragments of the meteorite. This has opened the door to a lot of other, more speculative and weird theories. Some have proposed that the explosion was caused by a small black hole passing through the Earth. Others have suggested it was an explosion of a huge pocket of natural gas that escaped from the ground. And then there are the more out there theories. One popular idea in the realm of science fiction and ufology is that the Tunguska event was the crash of an alien spaceship. The story goes that an alien craft experienced a malfunction and exploded, or was intentionally destroyed to prevent it from crashing into a populated area. Another strange theory connects the event to Nikola Tesla. Some have speculated that Tesla was conducting a long-range wireless energy transmission experiment from his laboratory in New York, and that he accidentally caused the massive explosion in Siberia. This theory is not taken seriously by scientists, but it persists in popular culture. In recent years, a new and more disturbing theory has been proposed by some Russian scientists. They suggest that the Tunguska event was not a natural phenomenon at all, but a man-made one. Specifically, they have put forward the idea that it was a nuclear explosion. This is a very controversial idea, as it would mean that nuclear technology existed like decades before the Manhattan Project. The evidence for this is thin and is not accepted by the mainstream scientific community. The Tunguska event is a powerful reminder that our planet is part of a larger cosmic environment. We live in a kind of celestial shooting gallery. The Earth is constantly being bombarded by objects from space. Most of them are small and burn up harmlessly in the atmosphere, but Tunguska shows us what can happen when a larger one gets through. If an event of that size were to happen over a major city today, it would be a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor event in Russia, which was much smaller than Tunguska, injured over 1,500 people and damaged thousands of buildings. Tunguska was a much, much bigger bang. So, what really happened in the skies over Siberia in 1908? Will we ever find a piece of the object that caused the explosion? A definitive clue that can solve the mystery once and for all. And what is our plan for a future Tunguska-sized event? Do we have the technology to detect and deflect such an object before it hits us? Number 2, did a man fight a war all by himself for 30 years? The story of Hiroo Onoda is a profound and almost unbelievable tale of loyalty, duty, and the power of belief. He was a Japanese soldier in World War II who did not surrender until 1974. For nearly 30 years after the war had ended, he continued to fight a one-man war in the jungles of the Philippines because he was convinced the war was still going on. Onoda was a young intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. In December 1944, as the American forces were advancing, he was sent to the small island of Lubang in the Philippines. His orders from his commanding officer were clear to stay and fight, to conduct guerrilla warfare, and to never surrender. He was told, it may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. A few months later, the American forces landed on Lubang. The Japanese garrison was quickly defeated. Onoda and a small group of other soldiers managed to escape into the dense jungle in the mountains. They were cut off from communication. Soon after, they started to see leaflets being dropped from airplanes announcing that the war was over and that Japan had surrendered. Onoda and his men looked at the leaflets. They decided they were a trick. They believed it was enemy propaganda designed to get them to give up. So they stayed in the jungle. They continued to follow their last orders. For years, they lived off the land. They ate bananas and coconuts. They occasionally stole cattle from the local villagers. They maintained their rifles and their ammunition meticulously. They saw the villagers as enemy collaborators. They would sometimes have skirmishes with the local police. Over the years, the other soldiers in his group either surrendered or were killed in these shootouts. By 1972, after one of his last companions was killed, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. The Japanese and Philippine governments knew that Onoda was still on the island. They tried many times to convince him to surrender. They dropped more leaflets. They dropped newspapers and letters from his family. They even used loudspeakers to broadcast messages from his relatives, begging him to come out. He saw and heard all of this, but he had been trained as an intelligence officer to be wary of deception. He rationalized everything he saw. He thought the letters were forgeries. He believed the newspapers were filled with lies. He thought the people speaking on the loudspeakers were Japanese prisoners being forced to talk by the enemy. His belief that the war was still on was so strong that he was able to explain away any evidence to the contrary. The situation finally changed in 1974. A young Japanese adventurer and student named Norio Suzuki decided he wanted to find three things: Hiro Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. He traveled to Lubang Island, and remarkably, he found Onoda. The two men spoke. Suzuki tried to convince Onoda that the war was over. Onoda still refused to believe him. But he did say one thing. He said he would only surrender if he was given a direct order to do so from his former commanding officer. Suzuki went back to Japan with this information. He managed to track down Onoda's commanding officer, a man named Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, who was now an old man working in a bookstore. The Japanese government flew Major Taniguchi to Lubang. In March 1974, he went into the jungle. He found Onoda's small camp, and there he stood before Hiro Onoda and formally read him the order to stand down. For Onoda, it was the moment his world changed. His 30-year mission was over. He walked out of the jungle, still wearing his tattered but clean uniform. He presented his sword to the Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos, understanding the extraordinary circumstances, pardoned him for the crimes he had committed during his long war, which included the deaths of about 30 local people. Hiro Onoda returned to Japan as a hero to some, and a strange relic of the past to others. He had trouble adjusting to modern Japan, a country he no longer recognized. He had followed his last order with absolute devotion for 30 years. His story is a powerful and disturbing look at the psychology of a soldier and the nature of duty. It raises profound questions about belief, reality, and how a person's mind can construct a world to match their convictions. But what was the exact psychological mechanism that allowed him to maintain his belief in the face of so much contradictory evidence for so long? Was it simply a case of extreme discipline or something closer to a delusion? And what does his story tell us about the power of orders and the responsibilities of those who give them? Number one, did a man steal the Mona Lisa and become a national hero? The Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci is probably the most famous painting in the world. It's kept under bulletproof glass in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it's protected by a fortress of security. But in 1911, it was stolen, and the man who stole it was not a master criminal. He was a simple Italian handyman who worked at the museum. His name was Vincenzo Perugia, and his theft turned the Mona Lisa from a respected work of art into a global icon. The theft was surprisingly simple. On Monday, August 21st, 1911, the Louvre was closed for cleaning. Perugia had worked at the museum before. He knew the routine. He wore a white smock just like the other workers. He went into the gallery where the Mona Lisa was hanging. He waited until no one was looking. He simply took the painting off the wall, removed it from its frame, and hid it under his smock. Then he walked out of the museum. The Mona Lisa was gone. It took over 24 hours for anyone at the museum to even realize the painting was missing. When they did, it caused a massive scandal. The French police were baffled. They had no leads. They interviewed hundreds of people. They even questioned the famous artist Pablo Picasso because he had once bought some stolen statues from a man who had worked at the Louvre. But they found nothing. The theft was a huge embarrassment for the French government. The director of the Louvre was fired. The Mona Lisa was famous, but the story of its theft made it a household name all over the world. The newspapers were full of the story. For the first time, millions of people who had never been to an art museum saw a picture of the Mona Lisa on the front page of their local paper. For 2 years, the painting was missing. And where was it? It was in Vincenzo Perugia's small apartment in Paris. He kept it hidden in a trunk. He had stolen the most famous painting in the world, and he had no idea what to do with it. Why did he do it? Perugia was an Italian patriot. He believed that the Mona Lisa was a piece of Italian heritage that had been stolen by Napoleon and should be returned to Italy. This was actually a misunderstanding. Leonardo da Vinci had brought the painting to France himself when he went to work for the French king. It was not stolen by Napoleon, but Perugia believed he was righting a historical wrong. He was acting out of a sense of national pride. Finally, in 1913, Perugia decided to act. He took the painting to Florence, Italy. He contacted an art dealer named Alfredo Geri. Well, he offered to sell him the Mona Lisa. He said he wanted to see it returned to its rightful home in Italy. Geri was suspicious. He agreed to meet Perugia, but he also contacted the director of the Uffizi Gallery. They met Perugia in his hotel room. Perugia opened his trunk and showed them the painting. They immediately recognized it, they authenticated it, and then called the police. Perugia was arrested. the Mona Lisa was recovered. But the story doesn't end there. When the news of Perugia's motive came out, he became a national hero in Italy. The Italian public celebrated him as a great patriot who had tried to bring their national treasure home. His trial was a media sensation. He was given a very light sentence. He served only a few months in jail. Before being returned to France, the Mona Lisa went on a short tour of Italy. It was displayed in Florence, Rome, and Milan. Huge crowds of Italians lined up to see the famous painting that had been at the center of such a great adventure. It was a national celebration when the painting finally returned to the Louvre. It was more famous than ever before. The crowds who came to see it were massive. The theft and recovery had cemented its status as the world's most recognizable work of art. The story of Vincenzo Peruggia is a strange mix of crime, comedy, and national pride. It's the story of how a simple act of theft, motivated by a mistaken belief, transformed an object into a global celebrity. It shows that sometimes the story behind a work of art can become as famous as the art itself. But what was Peruggia's real plan? Did he really think he could just sell the painting to an Italian museum without getting caught? How much of his patriotic motive was genuine, and how much was just an excuse he came up with after he was arrested? And in a strange way, did this bumbling handyman, by stealing the Mona Lisa, actually do more to secure its fame than any art critic or historian ever could?